Okay, it's according to that clock at least 7 minutes past the hour, though not according to my watch. So we should probably get started. Welcome to the second Fairbanks Center Modern China lecture of the semester. My name is Arunabh Ghosh. I teach modern Chinese history in the history department here, and I also convene this lecture series. Before I introduce our honored speaker of the day, I want to announce or let you know about our final Modern China lecture of the spring semester. In about 6 weeks from now, we'll be hosting Joseph Ho from Albion College, who'll be talking about his work on the history of photography in modern China. That talk will also be at 4 p.m. And hopefully, if everything goes well, it'll also be online now. So we are actually online. So welcome also to the people who are joining us online. We have cameras all over the room, for those of you who are wondering what's going on. Hopefully we'll have an online audience going forward for future talks as well. Today, I'm delighted to welcome to Harvard and to the Fairbanks Center, Professor Yi-Shin Chen, who is Professor of History at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington. Professor Chen is a historian of 20th century China, specializing in the socioeconomic history of the early years of the People's Republic of China. He received his PhD in history from Washington University in St. Louis. As a matter of fact, his doctoral advisor is also here with us, Professor Bill Kirby.
Check it out.
That's right. Professor Chen is widely published in English, Chinese, and in Japanese. In 2009, an article he wrote for the journal Agricultural History was honored with the Vernon Carstensen Memorial Award for Best Article. He is also, most recently, the author of this terrific book, When Food Became Scarce, How Chinese Peasants Survived the Great Leap Forward Famine, which was published by Cornell University Press. It says 2024, but I think it's 24 or 25. It's just 24. Been out. 24, so it's just a few months. Professor Chen is now working on a project about collective peasant rebellions during the early years of the People's Republic of China. But I think today's talk is drawn from a part of the book itself, right? Chapter 3 of the book itself.
From
the new project. Book. Oh, it's even better. It's drawn from the new book. The title of the talk is Famine and Rebellion, the Counter-Revolutionary Case of the Chinese People's Life Saving Army in the Western Stream Villages, 1959 to 1960. Before I hand things over, just a few quick words about format. So the talk will be for about 45 minutes, so thereabouts. We'll then follow that with Q&A for about 30 minutes. For those of us joining us online, please use the Q&A function that you have to type up your questions, and I'll do my best to get to them when we have the Q&A after the talk. So, Professor Chen, a very warm welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. It's a great pleasure to give a talk at Harvard, particularly with my advisor, Bill Kirby, sitting here. It's a great honor. Okay, my topic for today's lecture is famine and rebellion. That is actually a chapter of my currently ongoing manuscript. However, because it was part of the famine, so that's why I'll pick up this topic because it will somehow relate to my book that was about the Chinese famine at the village level. So you can see the case. I actually try to present a case study. The case study is called the Chinese People's Life-Saving Army. It's called中国人民救命军, and you can see it was in the Shangtian People's Commune in Jishi County in Anhui Province. It's called Xi Brigade, so I simply translated it to Western Stream. So how I got to study this topic. So when I was studying famine, I have to read literature. So one literature I crossed was the published the Anhui Chronicle, the judicial volume. When I look at judicial volume, it was very surprising me. You can see the counter-revolutionary cases that were judged at court. In 1958, it reached to 94,384. That was 17.64 than the previous year. Then it naturally raised the question to me, why suddenly so many people became counter-revolutionaries, criminals, right? And if you look, particularly, China had the first suppression of counter-revolutionaries in 1950 to 1953, in which the Chinese Communist government executed more than 735,000 people. And in Anhui province alone, you can see here, the death penalty was 32,000. So many counter-revolutionaries had already been eliminated. Those were so-called past counter-revolutionaries with a connection to the nationalist regime. And in 1955 to December 1956, in the so-called second campaign to suppress counter-revolutionary, and you can see the execution was only 573. Basically, counter-revolutionaries, the past counter-revolutionaries, had been physically executed or destroyed or thrown in prison. Then in February 1957, Mao Zedong himself said very famously, there are still some counter-revolutionaries, but very few. So that we understand. So that was 1956-57. Then why suddenly so many people became counter-revolutionary? And it continued for 3 years of a great leap forward. And then we don't have the data for 1961 to 62. You look at 63 to 64, the counter-revolutionary cases were like 870. It's basically 800. So when you look at those data, it was so obvious, the people had great resistance to the Great Leap Forward. So that was quite obvious. Then the thing is, when you look who actually were the counter-revolutionaries, when you look at some cases, overwhelming majority of the counter-revolutionaries, they were convicted by so-called crime of speech. Simply, they complained. For instance, one case, a guy named Zhang Yunlong, a peasant in the Fengyang County of Anhui Province. In 1958, he complained that the provincial policy to change the dry land to paddies. Then he said, those dry lands were not going to hold water. It was not going to work. Then he was arrested and then convicted as a counter-revolutionaries because he sabotaged agriculture collectivization. Of course, he thought that was a very unjust penalty on him. So he protested in the labor reform, in the labor camp. Then, because he protested, then the local government added 5 more years. So he served 7 years. So, but those were people who simply complained. You can convict them just by the speech. You don't need any action. But counter-revolution groups were different. They must have action. If they had a group, they would have a leadership structure. They would have a group of people, and they need to make connections. And if they were counter-revolutionaries, they had to establish some kind of comradeship. So you must have action as evidence, not simply somebody whose speech became evidence. Then if you look, in September to October 1958, based on available data, in Anhui province alone, there are 335 so-called active counter-revolution groups. The active is called 现行反革命. That means the counter-revolutionaries emerge from a Maoist society, not the one the past counter-revolutionaries connect with the nationalist regime. So we look at so many groups. If you look at national data, in 1959, because 1958 was not available, we only had data for 1959 to 1960. They break it down, the different types of counter-revolutionaries, whether individual, whether groups. Then we know nationwide that 1959 alone, there are more than 28,000 of them. That's a lot. Then we understand that overwhelming majority took place in rural area. Why? Because they breaking down the elements who committed the counter-revolutionary crimes. And capitalists and the workers made only 4%. That means they were urban people. Overwhelming majority of the countryside. So if in the countryside, in the rural area, we know those through the peasants. Then it raises the question, why did peasants want to become counter-revolutionary? If they just suffer from hunger, they wanted food, they could simply organize a theft group to steal food. You don't have to be counter-revolutionary. Once you have a counter-revolution, that means you have political ideas, political ideologies. Then if you look at those peasants living in remote villages, in the mountains, they probably for their entire life have never been outside their valley. So from where could they get political ideas? Right? So that's another question. Then one more question, how they make connections, organize themselves to build a counter-revolutionary group. And they have to work in the production team, and they have to get a permission to leave their village to visit another village. So how they organize. So those are the questions that led me to begin to think about the the article and the book. Then when you look at the literature, we know that's a lack of research. Lack of research, reason number one was that Chinese government had restrictions archives. It's very difficult to have access to this type of archives. And number two was the political sensitivity. And China for a while, from late 1990s to late 2000, that's a window of freedom. During that time, scholars could really go to the county and local archives to dig out a lot of materials. But once they got materials, now they could not publish it. The government did not care whether you have materials, but they just simply don't want you to do the sensitive topics. And in recent years in the West, in the United States, we have a so-called grassroots history to write history from bottom. And we know some scholars like Jeremy Brown and Brian DeMaul, they wrote those grassroots history. They talk about how individuals were actually targeted by a local government and all those sort of stories. But the grassroots history was still very limited because they have no way to have access to those archives, particularly the collective action of Chinese peasants. And for individual archives, by the way, in late 1990s, people actually can purchase a lot just on street. Those kind of archives will leak out. However, even you have the opportunities to enter the archives to dig out the source materials, then you will find it's very difficult to do this type of research because there's a huge amount of unjust, false, and wrongfully convictions. In Chinese term, it's called 冤假错案. There are too many. How many? The data available will show you the Cultural Revolution period. Because in 1978, after the death of Mao in 1987, that was almost 10 years, so-called Great Ratification. A lot of cases were reversed. So when you look, how many cases in Anhui became, those counter-revolution cases became rectified? 83%. That means when you think of the legal system, 83% of the cases you previously charged were wrong, were fabricated, or were unjust. But this was for Cultural Revolution. It's easy to understand. In the early years, then the rectification went on to the Cultural Revolution. So basically in 1982 to 87, the entire China tried to rectify cases. So they re-examined in Anhui, they re-examined more than 129,000 cases. That was the criminal cases 1958 to 1965. And people were very surprised to discover 7% those cases were unjust, false, and wrongly convicted. So let me think first. I want to ask why peasants became counter-revolutionaries. Because of so many wrong cases that make me want. I must add a chapter to discuss state violence. So that's how my next book titled, actually this book titled, Rebellions and State Violence. Rebellions, I have 5 different types of rebellion. This is one kind. The other kind, for instance, the peasants dreamed to become an emperor, and then they became a counter-revolutionaries. Right? So with this kind of background information to understand why it became a topic, need to study and what's the issue there, and then we can look at this case, what I'm talking, the Chinese People's Life-Saving Army. The Life-Saving Army, it was published on the Anhui Chronicle Public Security Volume, and once it published in 1993, it basically meant these cases were definitive. You cannot rectify it. Okay? It's 1990s already. And what it said, basic story is this. In December 1959, a peasant named Fang Yingchang and Li Yingfa organized a reaction group. And then next would be on May 17th, 1960, they had a meeting in another that's called a Sunset Stream Brigade to discover how to develop the organization and try to gather weapons and start an armed rebellion and then go up to the mountains to fight guerrillas. And then very quickly, in just a few days, this organization developed 40 people. On the 22nd May, and they had 8 people come together. They called themselves the first company of the Chinese People's Life-Saving Army. It should be life, I'm sorry. Then on the 25th of May, that's 3 days later, and the policeman and the local communist cadre tried to investigate them to look what they were doing, and then they ambushed the policeman and the cadre. The policeman was killed, and then next day, the county party committee organized the headquarters of suppression, the bandit group. They mobilized more than 20,000 people, encircled those bandits. And then finally, the 8 people, on May the 31st, they were all captured. And after that, the public security officers arrest other kind of core members, 15 of them. So that's a whole case. It all happened in a very short period of time. Then, of course, this, if you read this, there's a lot of questions. So in December 1959, why did they organize the counter-revolution groups at this time? Not earlier, if they were really the counter-revolutionaries. And then, for instance, like this, they had a meeting to develop an organization. So from the 17th to the 22nd, how come in 5 days? They originally had 8 people. How come they so quickly developed to more than 40 people. There's many questions here. So now I'm going to talk this case in details. So where is the Jishi County? It's here. In southern Anhui province, it's here. And if you look where the commune is called the Shangtian commune here, and the Western Stream Brigade was actually here. And here is the Jishi County, and here is another county called Jingdun. So it's in the border area between Jishi County and Jingdun County. When you look at the mountains, those mountains were 300 to 800 above the sea level in terms of the height. When you look at those mountains, you just wonder, how many people live there? How they communicate to each other? They were basically isolated. So this is the Western Stream Production Brigade. And this brigade had 4 large villages. And here the headquarters, but the most important village going to be here, it's called Shushui. And they had those villages in the mountains. Those people, later we see, they are at age 20, 22, 23, 24 for their entire life. They have never walked out of those valleys. On what basis they could become counter-revolutionary, a kind of a political adversary to the communist government. So we look at those mountains. Then we look very briefly in 1960. What's the basic data for this Western Stream? It had total 275 households, 977 people, and per household was 3.55 people. You know, the average should be 4.3. Why so the household is so small? Because in the mountains, women did not want to marry there. They got so many single men as a single man household. So that was their base, the house. And then of those villages, you have more than 30 isolated single house in the middle of the woods, forest. If they were doing something there, nobody knew what they were doing. Okay? And even the county officials who want to go there, okay? It's remote. It's so remote. So the total farmland was over 4,000 mu, and per capita of 4.2. And that was quite a large amount of size of land. And here came another important thing. They produced rice, and the rice output was 360 jin per mu. So if we look at those data, there you know, per capita grain output was 15 ton. 15 ton was a very good number because when you look at the state defined the annual consumption for the peasants after collectivization was 500 jin. That means those people should have over 1,000 jin surplus. But surplus, of course, later they have all to be sold to the state. And then, more importantly, they live in the mountains, and the mountains belong to them, and they have per capita ownership of forest land 13 mu. And those 13 mu was like 2 acres. Right? One family should have like 4 acres. That means if they suffer from hunger, they could go to the forest to pick up a fruit and walnuts and bamboo shoot and mushroom and particularly kudo roots and bracken roots, because those roots have starch in it. So if you just eat bamboo shoots or dried mushrooms, it's not going to be enough. However, once you have those kind of starch in it, then that will be sufficient for them not to suffer from hunger. So in history, nobody in those villages had starved to death. Then in autumn 1958, People's Commune came, and there you have a public dining system, and then the entire brigade was divided into 6 production teams, and they had 10 public dining halls. People had to eat in the dining hall based on the rations, food rations. So in autumn 1958, there's no limit on how much everyone could eat. So life was good, and people enjoyed it. The reason people enjoyed the public dining hall was because those single men. They were lonely. Right? They now suddenly the entire village of people lived together. They said that they got a companionship when they were eating. Then in the first half of 1959, a ration established, 1.1 gin per day per capita. That's still pretty good. And then now the second half of 1959, it began to decline. It declined from 6 to 3 liao. Per liao was 50 grams. So if you have just 200 or 300 grams, it's not enough for people to survive. Right? Then by December, the grain ration stopped. And for 57 days, there's no grain ration, no food supply. And 9 of 10 dining halls shut down. And then people had to survive on their own. And then in mid-February 1962, and the grain ration resumed, and public dining halls reopened. But at this time, per capita was 2.5 liang per day. Not enough. It's going to continue all the way to summer 1960. So in our interview to the head of the brigade, he lived in the largest village called Xikan. They have 300 residents. He said, well, we only have 5 or 6 people died of starvation. They were all old people, had a chronic disease. They could not walk to the mountains to dig out the kuzo and the bracken roots. And the others, they were strong enough to go to the mountains. They were not going to suffer death. It's not good food, but at least they're not going to die. And the reason for the decline of food supply, of course, was the excessive procurement from the state. You can see in 1959, it increased almost 3 times, right? From 8.9 to 21. And you can see here very clearly the deaths increased and the population became a negative increase. So the state procurement, excessive procurement was an essential reason for food shortage. But the peasants, because they live in the mountains, they could still manage how to live. However, they want a good life, they want to eat rice, not simply the vegetation. Then what did happen? In 1959, starting from the summer harvest, the entire western stream began to steal food. Everybody, virtually everybody. The brigade leaders in summer 1959 decided to conceal 52,000 jin of grain and then distribute to all the peasant families. Then the county government discovered it. They sent the people to investigate. Then they finally discovered every member of the brigade, the party committee involved in it. They couldn't do anything. They cannot punish everyone. And then because they were doing this, and then spring 1960, and because the rice was not available, they began to steal rice seedlings. You can cook rice seedlings like vegetables. And then they also slaughtered in 2 teams. They slaughtered 3 draft oxen that would climb, and 3 pigs that were collectible properties. And when those people slaughtered draft animals, they simply report to the commune. Those animals were eaten by tigers. So, but nobody knows. Those mountains have no tigers at all. In summer 1960, that was after the crash of the life-saving army. The people will still keep stealing. You remember the life-saving army was crushed in May 1959. In 1960, but in summer they continued to steal in large quantity. Those people, they need to survive. They just continue to do what they need to do. they all came from the two large lineages, from two large villages. One was from Hu, the other was from Chen. Those people, they were cousins, they were uncles. They shared each other. And so the traditional culture gave them great protection. And then now came to the counter-revolution group. In March 1959 to April 1961, one thing happened. That was this county called Jingde was merged into Jishi. They became one county. Once it became one county, those people living here, previously, if they want to submit the land tax and surplus grain, they had to go all the way here. So there's 20 kilometers, but if you walk, you cannot simply go straight. You have to go all over here in a very long, very endurance. And now, because those two parts became one county, what they now need to do was to deliver the grain to the state granary in Jingde County. That changed. Then it happened to the Jingde County, it was here. When they began to receive the grain from the western stream and the bridge, another branch valley, it's called a Big Stream Brigade. They decided to build the transit granary in this village called Shushui. And then that offered a great opportunity. If you build a transit granary, you need people to watch it. Then the people to watch it were the local militia. Those local militia, when they watch those, I here put 4 people here. They all become the member of the life-saving army. Like 24, 22, 20, and they were Communist Youth League members. And this guy was even the head of the Communist Youth League branch of the Western Stream. He was the designated successor to be the leader of the entire brigade. And this one was only 20 years old, and they were all poor peasants and middle peasants. That was the backbone of the communist theory. And they were also the core member of the militia. That means they had the privilege, the rights to touch rifles. And so they were the trustworthy people in the eyes of the communists. However, they began to steal food together. They began to steal rice, yellow beans from that transit granary. And how many times they stole? From November 1959 to April 1960, they stole over 20 times because they need to form a group. They were the one who watched the granary, they stole it. So in this way, they slowly form the group. And another way to form a group over here. Look, the transit granary over here. And in order to more effectively work, the state granary station in Jingde County in summer and fall send a worker here to weigh all the grain. And after the weight, then he said, okay, here's 50,000 jing grain. We already weighed. Then you guys going to deliver to Jingde County. And you can see this only mountain road. They could carry 2 baskets and deliver. And when they delivered to the county's state granary, the state granary were not going to reweigh it. They simply give the receipt, food received, a grain received. So those people, when they discovered, that's an opportunity. So now when they were delivering, they made a stop here, a village called Sherdai, and there's abandoned Buddhist nunnery here. They began to, you cannot steal all of them, they began to get a handful from each basket. Because once you carry 10 baskets to the state granary simply say, received 10 baskets. they're not going to wait anymore. So slowly they was able to accumulate some grain here. They stored here, and then, but you remember, everybody was stolen, but everybody was stealing. But it's just those guys was stealing too much. So one guy, Chen Fu An, that was the youngest guy, 20 years old, and we interviewed him. He said later the legal institution said the counter-revolutionaries, they meet very often, and they meet very often. Those secret meetings before May 1960, the secret meetings were for cooking together and exchanging information about welfare. They were not counter-revolutionary. And then Hu Tian, another guy we interviewed, the director of the Western Stream Brigade at that time. And what he said was, he said at that time, every production team banner was already empty. So the brigade sent several militiamen to guard the Shushui Grand Station. That's the transit station. And those militiamen themselves stole grants through the station's windows. When the brigade discovered this, they were ordered to write self-criticism, and a few of them, fearing punishment, ran into the mountains. So that's how they ran away. And that guy was the head of the CY branch at Cheng Yiqiu. Because he was the head, he was forced to write self-criticism on May 4th. He complained again and again. I worked all day and I had to write my confessions every evening. It was too hard. So what to do? Those people, 4 of them, had a meeting. They decided we go to mountains. Now, they go to the mountains. On May the 5th, they went to the mountains. However, this guy, the middle-aged man, Fang Yingshan, who had urine stones, was painful. He couldn't go. So the other 3 went. They were waiting him in that Buddhist nunnery. And they were waiting him May the 15th, he went there. And then May the 17th, that's the charge. They had a meeting. Where they had a meeting? They meeting with another commune. They tried to find this man called Chen Changlei, very interesting guy. He was a barber in the villages. Barber traveled to all the villages. He cut the hair for the men, not for women. And this guy talked a lot. He was the one, he mentioned them, oh, there's a rumor, People's Life-Saving Army in all of the places. So those guys, they were hiding in the mountains. They did not know what next to do. They decided to went to his home. That was in called the Zhuangli village. Zhuangli village at the Sunset Stream Brigade. They said, we're looking for him. Tell us where the life-saving army is. He said, I don't know. And I just met some people, so they was the life-saving army. So he said, I can join you because he was 33 years old. He said, I still have a very young daughter, my wife. So those guys now, they went back. Then they went to a village called Shadai and Shijingken, and the other young people from the neighboring brigade, they formed friends, and they mobilized 4 of them, joined them, and then on the 22nd, they declared they were the first company of Chinese People's Life-Saving Army. The first company only got 8 people. They tried to declare themselves People's Life-Saving Army. Then the head, Fang Yingshan, said, army was too big. We make ourselves the first company instead of the entire army. So you can look, all 4 of them came from the same village, Shushui, and they were from the Chen family. And those people, the neighboring village, and then on 24th, they received information that the policeman from the county government, policeman, and the local cadre is going to invest them. The next day, 25th, they decided to set an ambush to kill the policeman and kill the policeman and the cadre. So what the counter-revolutionaries, basically, they became a group because they had a fear of the punishment, and the worst language they used was go up to the mountains to fight guerrillas. Though that was quoted again, that they had an intention for armed rebellion. But that was just their talk. They did not know what to do next. To fight guerrillas, have they ever proposed to fight guerrillas against the Chinese government, against the local government? Never. They never said that. And the PRC regulations, that was in 1952, that all the counter-revolutionists must have intentions to overthrow the people's democratic regime, as the common government, or undermine people's democratic cause, so disrupt the society. Maybe they barely touch it if they go fight guerrillas in the mountains. And so, in terms of political ideology, they did not have. In terms of practice, it's impossible. They knew that. And the public security officers every spring going to search the mountains in southern Anhui. That's the mountains. They look how thoroughly they did. In Anhui, in January to March, how many policemen, cadres, and militia they involved, and how many people they dig out from the caves, from the ravine, from the isolated temples. They did it every year because people would run away from communist government. They were hiding themselves in the mountains, and the mountains are January to March because all the leaves drop. You can see people. If it's spring the summer, there's no way to do the mountain search. So that's the reason why every January to March they did that. So practically they knew they were impossible to do that. And one more was that the government officials did not think it's a big idea for those guys. The Western Stream Bridge brigade leaders. So those were the young men. They had a fear. They run away. All right? And the deputy party of the Shantian Coming, who had his working side in the Western Stream, and then the deputy director of the Public Security Bureau, director of the Public Security Bureau, the secretary, the deputy secretary of the party committee, all of them thought they were Coming members. No major issues. That was the 24th. Next day, those people became counter-revolution. So they believe those people were heading to Jiangxi because Jiangxi offered food, and they carry hatchets. That's a weapon. They say hatchets cut the woods to sell, for expenses to go to Jiangxi. So that was how the government officials understood, and they did not even think a little bit. Those people hiding in the mountains were counter-revolutionaries. So, but they sent a policeman to go there, and on 24th, somebody reported them. They were hiding here. It's called the Shi Dai, the Buddhist nunnery, and they tried to ambush, but that the policeman, the cadre left. And then on the 25th, another policeman, the cadre came here. They tried to ambush them, but the policeman, the cadre, went to this village called Shijingkan. They went here, they didn't catch them. Then they wait on the road. When that policeman, the cadre, went back, and then they fired bullets for shotguns that they borrowed from the mountain hunting people. And then they were caught. How many? 44 people. So this was from the archives of the Shantian Commune. 44 people, look, only one guy was a rich peasant. All 43 of them were middle peasants, poor peasants. So they were not counter-revolutionaries by nature, right? And then at this time, we couldn't figure out whether they were counter-revolutionaries. And then we look at all those 44 people, most were young, they were all males. And Western Stream only had 13, 9 of them from the same village. And from far away, another 2 bridges. They had 6 villages, they had 27 members. The other 4 were from someplace else. So when I look at this, I simply couldn't figure it out. Those people from Shui, the first company people, they have no chance to know or to meet the people from far away. Then when I think, finally I figured out, this is the guy, Chen Changlai, the barber. The barber who traveled everywhere. He knew all the names. When he was forced to confession, he simply told those names. Those were his customers. Most of them were his customers. Those customers now, because his confession, became the member of the counter-revolution group. And then there was another suspect list, 15 of them. From here you can see women, and on the suspect list there's 1 rich peasant and many women. There are 2 women on the line here because that's the result. All 44 of them received the penalty. 7 a death penalty, and this guy, Fang Yunshan, death penalty. He was caught in the mountains, and then when he was sent back to Jishi County, on halfway he jumped off the bridge and over the cliff. He killed himself. He committed suicide. And this one, the core members, Li Xinfa, Chen Yichu, they're all death penalty. Then you suddenly saw this guy, Zhou Jiahui. He was not in that 44, not even in the suspect list. Then how come he received the death sentence? Because the government want to politicize this case. They want a landlord to be in it. Then they called Zhou Jiahui was sort of an Italian hand, right, behind all of this. And then now you can define it as a counter-revolutionary group, more manipulated by landlords, by landlord class. And then now you can see this Zhang Hexian was a woman, 54 years old. Why was he was sentenced to death? He got nothing to do. Why? He lived in Shadai. And this guy, one of the 8 members came from Shadai. She was his mistress. You know, in that tiny village, only 4 or 5 households there. She had her own husband, but she was also his mistress. Now, she was the one who tipped this group on the morning of the 25th that a policeman and the cavalry came to investigate. Then she needed to die. So that's the death sentence. And another guy named Xu Boru, he got nothing to do with it here, and he was the one who was criminal, escaped from a labor farm, from a labor camp, and was hiding in the mountain. On the 26th, that was already 26th, he encountered those 8 people that he decided to join them. And they become sworn brothers. He decided to join them. He didn't do anything. But because he was escaped criminal, and then now he must die. So this death sentence. The barber, Chen Changlai, was sentenced to death, and later on for the intermediate court, they decided to have death with a reprieve, 2 years reprieve. And because he got a very young daughter, he needed somebody to support. And this woman named Zhang Dingxia, 47, she was sentenced to death and then changed to life imprisonment. The reason was that she was the one who tipped her mistress, that's this man. Look, they live in the same village. and she was the mistress of Xiao Yinglin, and on the 24th, she tipped to Xiao Yinglin that the commune and the policeman came to investigate guys. And Chen Fuan, that man 20 years old, he was a life imprisonment. Then when we went to interview them in 2000, he was the only one from this group who were alive. However, he was released in 1981. So at that means 60 years old. And he was released at 40, and then he was 60 years old. So let me very quickly draw a conclusion. First, this famine caused event. And the famine caused event, you have seen this. Then what I want to say is the provincial level cases in 1958 to 1961, there's 16 cases that was handled by Department of Public Security at the provincial level, and 15 of them took place in rural areas, 1 in urban. That means rural area was in trouble. And that I think it was famine, 1958 to 1961. Then you look at data again, 1962 to 65. There are only 2 provincial level cases, counter-revolutionary group cases, and they both in urban center in the city called Bengbu. There's no rural cases. So that's one. It showed very clearly famine was one of the big factors for counter-revolution. So 2, they were not genuine counter-revolutionaries. So 16 cases at provincial level, 7 of them, like this one, was respond to food shortage. 8 of them were sect organizations. They want to create a new dynasty or become an emperor. Only 1 I consider the true counter-revolution cases that were called Chinese Labor Party. And that was organized by a student kicked out from Beijing University back to his hometown. He decided he wanted to have a political constitution, and he wanted to call for democracy, for change of political system. That, by definition, was a truly counter-revolution cases. And their basis, organization basis, were lineage and kinship based, not based on comradeship. That means not based on the ideology. And the last thing, we came to excessive state violence. You have seen how many people were executed. That came in May 1962, Chinese Central Political Legal Work Conference. Liu Shaoqi at that time was in charge of the legal work. He said the political and the legal work, that was in his biography, treat the internal contradictions, that's Mao's term, with people, within the people as the issue of the enemies and the allies. And the legal, political legal work had the style of Kuomintang. You compare them to Kuomintang, and standing about the people and exerting pressure on them. So to this point, I would think if I continue to write this book, so what was the larger question I'm going to ask? I wrote chopped about the cases, about the false, unjust, and wrongly convicted cases. Then how am I going to view it in the larger history of the People's Republic, or even in the history of modern China? Then what I can think, I'm still in developing in my writing, this kind of a suppression that excessively uses state violence caused the legitimacy cost to the communist government. And that will force them late to officially pronounce the criminal law and remove counter-revolutionary as a crime. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. That was a really fascinating case study, I think, or even a micro-history in some ways. I'm going to throw the floor open in a second for questions, but maybe I'll use my prerogative to ask the first one. Several, but maybe I'll just start with one. which is that in the book that you've just published, in addition to lineages, which you did focus on, you also talked about the role of the environment and local geography in sort of allowing for certain kinds of patterns of, in whether it's access to food or in this case, perhaps organization to emerge. So I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit upon what role geography and environment play also in these stories of counter-revolution or rebellion. Especially if you think about rebellion, there's a much longer history of scholarship that does look at geographical factors to talk about different kinds of patterns of consolidation and behavior. And of course, Anhui is specific. So by extension, there are other parts of China where you don't have mountains and forest cover in the summer and so on. So how would sort of some of those findings apply to places where, in the plains, for instance, and so on?
When I studied these cases, I think lineage still play a very important role because those counter-revolutions from rural society mostly came from villages. Mm-hmm. Like those two villages I mentioned, they were from a single lineage. The villager, Xika and Shushui, had been there for almost 1,000 years. Mm-hmm. So they have a very proud ancestor. So the people were willing to support each other. So they were easily form the group. That's one thing. And in terms of natural geography, I think geography played a very significant role. Because when you look, that was when I studied all those cases, except the Chinese Labor Party. All of the others developed either in mountainous areas or in the area was less administrative. It is so-called joint border area.
Yeah, boundary areas. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that was very important. When you think, particularly, I want to show the satellite image so the people have a sense. When you look at those villages, remote, isolated in the mountains, who would care to go there to find them? Right? And whatever they were doing there, they did not know. I think it's very important. Geography and the lineage both play a very important role. When later we think, for instance, in 1950s to 1980s, there are at least 4,000 or 5,000 Chinese people claim themselves emperors or try to create dynasties. And most of them happen in the mountain states.
Okay, the floor is open. Maybe I can ask you to come to the middle over here. Okay. I'll go over there because we might get questions from our online audience too. And if you could also quickly identify yourself, that'd be great. So I'll hand over. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Tom Palmer, a former journalist. Do you know what percentage of people died in that overall population during that famine?
Famine, it's about, I think demographers generally agreed about 27 to 30 million people perish due to the starvation because overwhelming majority, I would say 99% of them were peasants. So that makes about 5.4% of the Chinese rural population. Yeah.
And in Anhui?
Anhui was a kind of, Anhui and the Sichuan were unique. They had more people dying.
Many.
Yes. And when I read Sichuan Chronicle, I couldn't believe it. Even the Chronicle itself said more than 7 million people perished.
Ogden Ross. I'm a local. And the 1959 PRC involvement with basically what they were doing, they were taking surplus rice away from the peasants. Because as I understand it, they were trying to pay balance of payment to the central government because they were trying to pay off international debt somehow?
Not international debt. China at that time did not owe anybody debt. They basically tried to using grant to pay to Eastern European countries to exchange it for industry equipment.
To industrialize.
Yeah.
So they were sucking positive cash flow out of the country to try to change the emphasis of the country and push it into an industrialized direction. Actually, my question is, when the one individual who was thrown out of the Beijing university came home, started a small counter-revolutionary cell, which was called a democratic movement. Reminds me quite a bit of Tiananmen Square. that there was a causality against the PRC because the PRC was treating the people unfairly, which caused what they claimed was a reactionary movement against them. But actually, it was a revolutionary movement against the previous revolutionary environment, revolutionary government that had become conservative and no longer revolutionary. So they could not stand the possibility of having a counter-revolution against themselves because they had become too consolidated in their power.
Well, I don't think I can answer this question very well, but generally, the Communist Party viewed the former nationalists as so-called the past counter-revolutionaries. They were political enemies. And then after 1953-54, when the Communist Party started building a nation, it tried to industrialize the country. Those who opposed their policies were considered counter-revolutionaries. So that was the basic pattern. It's difficult to define who were the counter-revolutionaries who were not. Also, the communist target was not so clear. It often moved. And you can see here, for instance, the data showed in 1 year you have more than 90,000 counter-revolution cases. And a few years later, you only had 800. Their target also moved. Their policy also changed.
Well, thank you very much. Fascinating and inevitably tragic story. The ending was not going to be good. Thank you very much for that and for this amazing book that you've written. Just one footnote to the conversation we just had. I remember coming across in the archives data about, and letters about the grain that was sent, and it's a form of debt, this barter credit exchange with Russia and Eastern Europe, sent to the Soviet Union that stayed at a steady state all the way through the famine. And indeed, when the Berlin Wall was erected on August 13th, 1961, Zhou Enlai sent a special shipment of grain to Otto Grotewohl, the head of the East German Communist guys. He was the premier of the German Democratic Republic, saying that as you stand in front of the West German bandits, this is from the Chinese people to help you go on. But it's just insane, of course, that this grain is being sent in actually significant quantities to fulfill a business obligation. Just one question and then a larger question. One factual question. For those who went to prison, not executed, how many of them lived to get out of prison?
For this particular case, I don't know very much. And I think when we interviewed the guy named Chen Fuan, And he basically said all the people had already died. He was the only one, single one, survived.
This is the one who was after 20 years was released.
Yeah, he was 20 years old, and he was released at 41. And when we visited him, he was over 60. And he never get married, of course. And I think from other cases, writing, what I found was some people who were sentenced, and then this case early in 1955 to 56. Then in 1959, 1960, when some of them sentenced for 3 or 4 years, then were released from prison, they died in famine.
Wow. So can you tell the group here, though, a little bit about how you did this research, how you came across it? Have there been local histories or local chronicles, gazetteers written since this time? What access to archival and non-archival materials were you able to get? Your interviews and so on. About just, because you're pursuing counter-revolutionary research here.
Well, for this research, I first say, when I doing the grateful family, the villager family, I first found that there's so many food riots that was not characterized to counter-revolution. Food riots killed more people. And then we need to understand those events. And then we look at the judicial volume and the public security volume, we found cases. So we follow these cases to those areas to see whether still some people alive and were willing to do interview to understand what's really going on. So that's one way we have some interviews. And then for the cases I'm writing, I actually have some archive sources. So archive sources, I didn't do it myself. It was Chinese scholars who did it. They had the archive sources. Basically, I used my overseas sources. Some China did not have, exchange with them. Mm-hmm. And they, on the other hand, they saw that they got these sources. Of course, they were friends, but on the other hand, they did not think it's very useful to them because they could not get any article published. So they said, okay, we exchange it for you, and you go ahead and write your English, and we write something else. But they were willing for us to collect a lot of sources that China did not have. And another part of the sources, a lot of cases I write not in particular detail, particularly about data and those sources, came from internal publication of the Ministry of Public Security. It's in Hong Kong. It's available in Hong Kong. And the reason available in Hong Kong was that some of back to like 15 or 20 years ago, some children, the high-ranking officials, they got a lot of internal sources out, and then they printed books, sell for money. So at Chinese University in Hong Kong had a lot of them. So I used them. And I try to avoid to use sensitive sources, or I use a lot of data from the Anhui Chronicle that was published.
Thank you so much for your fascinating talk. My name is Haolan Zheng. I'm visiting from Keio University, Japan. I have two questions. One question is related to the connections between different villages you just mentioned in your case. I did some research on the Google map, and I found that actually they are very far apart from each other. So I'm very curious about how they could organize the riots, and what's the connection between these villages? That's my first question. And the second question is related to the operating way of the state violence, because these days I'm also thinking about this issue. By whom and how were counter-revolutionaries determined? It seems that many people, they were labeled as counter-revolutionary, even they had no organized activities at all. And it seems that the cadres from the county level to the township level and even to the brigade level, they could decide lots of things. It's so arbitrary. So is it because, is there any procedures? I think there was no procedures for cadres to decide. Just I'm curious about your opinions.
The first question to me is very clear. For the counter-revolution in the rural society, once they formed a group, the very fundamental way to organize them was relatives, lineage members, relatives. For instance, one case I just finished, they had armed rebellion. When you look at armed rebellion, they had about 30 peasants. You would just think 30 peasants, right? Armed rebellion want to build a new dynasty in Beijing. Those 30 parents came from 3 families. And those 3 families separated by 20 kilometers, but they were relatives. And one family heard another guy in that family wanted to become an emperor. They said, okay, can I become a marshal? Yeah, sure, you can become a marshal. You can become great marshal. Then he said, okay, I join the group. So that's their relatives. For instance, this man with their in-laws. With their daughter's in-laws. So that was essentially the way. Otherwise, most groups would emerge from the same village. So, sorry, your second question.
The operating way of the state violence.
State violence, I did not have very mature thinking now because it's going to be my last chapter. However, I think there's a great deal of sources have been published on DVDs by Song Yong-yi, and he had those. They had a lot of internal meetings, speeches from Minister of Public Security, Roy Chin, and deputy ministers, and from 1949 all the way to about 1960. And you read all of them to see how they organized their apparatus and how they formulated the ideas about society, how they perceived the enemies, and what the measure they're going to use to suppress all the political adversaries. Then you'll finally have a clear picture about the state violence and how it's going to use. And you have to read all their speeches.
Thank you very much. I
know we have a couple more questions, but we have a question that sort of relates to this conversation that's come in online. So let me ask that first, and then we'll go to you in the back. So this is from Professor Sung Pei-dong, who's at Cornell. She says, thank you for this fascinating talk. I have a question regarding the legitimacy cost of Mao's Great Famine. How should we understand the transformation mechanism by which a legitimacy cost evolves into a control advantage, particularly in the context of resource scarcity like food shortages? Is this phenomenon applicable across different regime types, including both authoritarian and democratic systems? While democracies may not use food as a control tool, could similar mechanisms be observed through other means, such as mass layoffs?
I would say I have some thoughts, but I did not write into this. When you think about the different political systems, we have seen the famines. We have seen traditional society. You have a traditional famine. Traditional famine, you can simply call it a affair of the nature. Right? Then for democratic societies, I think Amartya Sen did very well, and it was a failure of the market. And then when you look at socialist famine, you have the Ukraine famine in 1930s, Great Leap Forward famine in 1950s, and you have a North Korean famine in 1990s. And that all came with some big scheme and then failed. So I would rather call it a failure of the state. Mm-hmm. But I didn't write it in, but you can clearly identify the basic difference between them. Yeah.
Yes, at the back.
Yes, I just like to quickly add a comment or element I think that might be of your research interest in the future, because my grandfather, he actually committed suicide. He was not convicted because he was afraid that he would become convicted as a counter. Sorry, I'm too excited about this. Yeah, but he definitely, because he was a member of the Three Principles of People, Youth League member. So he and he saw all those counter revolutionaries were executed, and he was terrified of all those experiences. So he killed himself. So I'm wondering if you have done research in any case study in that direction or any future research interest?
No, unfortunately, that's not part of my research. I'm more interested in socio-economic changes, political changes that can be reflect group actions. So when you talk about individual, you have so many. For instance, I already gave the example. More than 90,000 in 1958. The counter-revolution cases in the entire country were close to 900,000. If you look at individual cases, everybody had some suffering, but then it's difficult to, from individual cases, unless you do massive them. Otherwise, you have difficult to understand how the policy and the socioeconomic changes, interaction between the state and the individual, led to that kind of antagonism against the state, also the excessive suppression from the state. And for an individual case, I just want to add one more sentence. In 1958 to 1960, the communists perceived society needed to be as clear as a crystal. They called it crystal society, or called a glass society. They would not allow the enemies physically exist in this society. So in your grandparents' case, their history had a spot, and their personal histories would not fit the people's society.
But still, thank you for giving voice to those deceased, and at least their stories are heard. Thank you. Even though I'm amazed by the case study. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm Will Sack, PhD candidate in history here, working on rural history. So I hope you won't mind one sentence of just wow at the beginning, which is I thought this was marvelous, and I look forward to talking more tomorrow, because I think this goes back to primitive rebels and homespun and really the origins even of how we think about agricultural history. I wanted to ask a question about the rectification rate in Anhui, if you don't mind, a slightly technical question, which is I was looking at rectified cases in Shanxi, and they divided into two categories in that case. One where it was unjust, false, or wrongly convicted, and one where, and admittedly I was looking at ones from Cultural Revolution, but one unjust, false, wrongly convicted, and then on the other hand, ones where there is no disavowal of the fact pattern. The fact, they say we got the facts right, but the punishment was wrong. And I was wondering, in this case, are those two categories together in your unusually high rate, so that they say, actually, we think we got the counter-revolutionaries, but we punished them too hard? Or are all of these 100? Your number was 83%. Is the 83% a complete admission of the facts being wrong in 83%? Because I'm curious behind that if your category of counter-revolutionary is the same as the courts or different. That's the question behind the question.
Okay, that's a very good question. In 1978 to 87, the first 4 years, we tried to correct cases in the Cultural Revolution. So what is so-called counter-revolutionaries were mostly just people who had said some words to support Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping. So that's easy to correct. So that's the reason why the percentage of unjust, wrongfully convicted is so high, to about 75%. And then I would say, in the rectification, they have policies. The policy first was to correct the Cultural Revolution for those political leaders who had supported those previous political leaders. And then the next, they're going to correct the case. Only the criminals and his family members appeal. If the case was settled, nobody appealed. They're not going to go look for the cases. And the third was they defined 9 categories, like overseas Chinese and former nationalist generals and those people. In the 1980s, you want to invite the people from Taiwan, from Hong Kong, to invest in mainland China. So those people, overseas Chinese and former nationalists, and 9 categories, those people, they did not need to appeal. All their cases were simply going to be uniformly re-examined, and I think the majority had been revised. And then I used the Cultural Revolution data to indicate that the political cases, counter-revolution, was very high. Then when it came to pre-Cultural Revolution, 1958 to 1965, when I said 78%, that was mostly criminal cases, not the counter-revolutionary. I don't know how many were counter-revolutions, but some of them were correct, were rectified. And I found the evidence, that's from Sichuan, from the Provincial Chronicle, the Public Security and the Judicial Chronicle. They said very clearly, they correct 50% of the cases. The other 50%, those cases relate to 5 black elements: landlord, rich peasants, counter-revolutions, rightists, and bad elements. They're not subjected to re-examination. So you have just to look at the policy to understand how the policy characterizes them.
Great. I know we have a few different questions, a few more questions, so maybe we can take them together because we're at time. So Michael, then over here, and then Bill will have the last.
Bill, it sounded like you maybe had a 2-finger. No. Oh, okay. So I know we're at time, but I'll follow Will with just a wow statement of thank you so much for this wonderful, provocative research. So I find myself after an hour quite confused as to whether or not there were counter-revolutionaries in this episode, which I think is actually probably historically unknowable. What we do know, and this follows a little bit from Professor Jung's question, what we do know is that certain agents of the state at this moment identified these people as counter-revolutionaries. And I wonder if you can say a little bit more about that. It's complicated, as you showed, to identify counter-revolutionaries, because then you have to find a black element, right? As you pointed out with the landlord who gets dragged in. It's a much higher, I mean, pilferage, theft, sabotage is universal in this period. Can you tell us a little bit, based on having examined these documents, why these group of officials might have decided that these people met the bar for counter-revolutionaries? What were the incentives that shaped the agents of the state in applying this category, rather than just saying, these are hoodlums, we had to go round them up? Tell us a little bit, if you can, about how the state, and not the state, the agents of the state, the cadres in the community, are making these kinds of decisions. Did you get points for finding counter-revolutionaries?
Yes. Mm-hmm. And that's a point. Well, in 1958, you have to understand that, first of all, the so-called Great Leap Forward is not just agricultural economy. It's so-called all walks of life. And so for the legal system, the Great Leap Forward for the public security was simply arrest more people. They have a quota. And then for the court, just simply you judge more people. And then for prosecution, they just prosecute more people. And because the legal system did not have enough people, then they decide one person going to perform 3 roles. And that 3 roles would be detective and judge and the prosecutor. And the case can be solved on site. And that case can be one person from the legal system went down, and then for one morning, the case had been cracked down and sentenced. And then there's other cases, for instance, 2 judges. They were given the job to prosecute more, to judge more. Then they judged 2 people in 3 months. 2 people in 3 months judged more than 2,000 cases. And they just announce what's your decision. So there's high pressure. And then when you look at those internal documents, a lot of those individuals as an agent, they make a confession why they fabricate cases, because they had pressure from above, and also they want performance. The performance was the way they could get promoted. Yeah. There's a lot of individual motivations. And in my, when I look at all the cases, basically, if you have counter-revolution cases, if it is over, counter-revolution cases were over 30 people, to my experience, it almost is a false. And one case, for instance, that's Cultural Revolution in 1968 to 69 in northern Anhui province. They have one counter-revolution cases that involved how many? 1,400 people. 1,400 people. Some committed suicide, some were sentenced, and finally, at the end of Cultural Revolution, they found it completely fabricated.
I think we'll take both questions together. So wait till you hear the last one from Bill. But no, thank you. That was terrific. Yeah.
Hi there. Thank you, Professor. My name is Ben. I'm a PhD student here in the East Asia department. You actually partly answered one section of the question already, which was, what is a case here? Does a case comprise one person? Does it comprise multiple people? Because I work on the modern PRC history of Xinjiang, and in Xinjiang, a lot of internal circulation sources mix them up sometimes. So they'll say, one counter-revolutionary group, 50 cases, and they actually mean like 50 people. But you've explained that. My other question is, in your piece, you're talking about the numbers of cases. There's a much higher number of cases from the period 58 to 65 than during the Cultural Revolution itself that later get sort of dealt with, and people get exonerated. So I was just wondering, what do you make of that? Why are there so many more cases going on during the pre-Cultural Revolution period than after that get overturned from 79 to 82? Is it because, like you just said, the Cultural Revolution cases are much bigger organizations? Because in Xinjiang, the situation flips. So in Xinjiang, actually, there are way more Cultural Revolution cases than before. So I'm just interested.
And then let me just add again my thanks. You made the point that, at least for me, but I don't know the history that as well as you. In the early 1950s, the initial anti-counter-revolutionary campaign, which starts after the Korean War breaks out in earnest, it starts is a not entirely indiscriminate, but pretty indiscriminate reign of terror, in which there were quotas by county. Some of them set directly by Mao Zedong himself, and I suppose it helps later on when one is trying to figure out whom to convict and so on. In this period, it doesn't appear that there were automatic quotas. People were reacting to things that happened, And when that happens, you find some usual suspects. So landlord, even though the landlord has no land, or a rich peasant who has no riches, nevertheless, they're the usual suspects you round up. Were there two questions? Too quickly. Were there quotas of any sort during the period you're talking about? And second, of those who were, you said 900,000. We've heard of other figures much larger than 900,000 for those executed in the early 50s. Were those cases also subject to a significant amount of revision and rehabilitation, or was that only for later cases?
I think it'll be very quickly. First, those cases were late in 1980s, subject to review.
Okay.
And for I lost the track of your first question. The quotas. My understanding is that a quota existed in the first suppression of the counter-revolution, 1950 to 53, and that's the quota given by Mao.
Right.
1 per 1,000 and 0.5 per 1,000, and then during the Great Leap Forward, the quota existed from 1958 to 59, and that was a quota decided by each provincial government. And later on, that relates to his question, later on, we still have a lot of cases in Cultural Revolution. But one thing I want to point out is that the Chinese legal system, after all, was making progress, at least in terms of procedure. For instance, when I look at the cases in early 1950s, you can simply announce somebody with counter-revolutionary and shot him on sight. And then by 1956 to 57, we look at all those cases, and you have all the search warrant, arrest warrant, and confession report, and interrogation reports, and all those kinds of. So back to you. In 1958 to 65, there's certainly more cases, but because at that time the government did not have control of the legal system agents, and it's going forward. And you're absolutely right about Mao had the class struggle theory. You need to be alert to class enemies. But when I think of the Cultural Revolution, it came two things. First, 公检法, that's public security, legal system, and prosecution, it was destroyed. And you don't have that kind of you don't have that kind of manpower to continue all that kind of procedures. On the other hand, you have to do a lot of procedures. So that was the reason why during the Cultural Revolution, almost every large factories, every institutions have their team called a 外调 to investigate, investigate somebody suspect. They would do it themselves, not legal people to do it. So that explains why later on the Cultural Revolution's period came with fewer cases than in 1958 to 65.
Great. Well, we're past time, which I guess suggests how exciting and enticing this work is, and I think you've really modeled for us what sort of microhistory and sort of bottom history can do, and individual case studies can do. So we really look forward to the book, and please join me in thanking.
Trump's continued face-off with the courts has some questioning whether the U.S. has reached the point of a constitutional crisis. On that and more, we turn to the analysis of Brooks and Capehart. That's New York Times columnist David Brooks and Jonathan Capehart, associate editor of The Washington Post. Good evening, gentlemen. Nice to have you both. I want to talk about President Trump and the courts. I mean, the president has wielded his authority in, I think, by any measure, in an extraordinary way. slashing budgets and jobs across the federal government, targeting billions of dollars at colleges and universities, threatening major law firms. On immigration, we've all been following that remarkable process. But the courts, David, in many instances, have stood up to the president. Do you think that they are doing their appropriate role of check and balance?
Yeah, I think they are. The question is whether Trump pays any attention to the courts. And so to me, watching the Trump administration is just like watching the administration say, you know, we've decided stoplights don't apply to us. Yellow lines down the middle of the road don't apply. We're just going to roll over it, and you stop us. And when you think constitutional crisis, you think like two sides facing off on the barricades. But I've actually lived through a constitutional crisis. When I was at the Wall Street Journal, I covered the end of the Soviet Union. And it was obviously very different in many ways. But one thing was interesting, the mental adjustment I had to make. When I went to the Soviet Union...
The mental adjustment?
Yeah, at the very end. Because I grew up in a country where I assume if a law is passed, then things will change. It will be enforced, and it'll be a reality on the ground. But at the very end of the Soviet Union, they would pass law after law, and nothing happened. Nobody bothered to enforce it. It never had any implementation. So the laws were fictional because people had lost faith in the laws, lost faith in the whole system. And so what happens now is not that you get this big conflict, but Trump just says, we're going to arrest a guy who give him no due process. And there's like no confrontation, it just happens. And nobody's there to stop it because famously the judiciary doesn't have an army.
Right. Jonathan, what do you think about that? I mean, we had Georgetown law professor Steve Vladeck on the show. He says we're not quite there yet because the Trump administration has not yet formally blown through, overtly ignored a direct court order yet. But we also heard from the League of Women Voters, the nonpartisan organization, who this week, I'd like to read you this quote. They said, quote, "It has now been 87 days since the start of the Trump administration. From the flagrant disregard for congressional authority and governmental checks and balances to defying Supreme Court orders to bring Kilmar Abrego Garcia back home, one thing is abundantly clear. Our country is in a constitutional crisis." Where do you come down on that?
I am glad you read that because I was nodding in agreement with the League of Women Voters. How can you say that the president hasn't, defied court orders? You've got Judge Boasberg, who is says yesterday that there's probable cause to charge the government or lawyers arguing on behalf of the government with criminal contempt. Why? Because the president of the United States and his administration ignored his order to not deport those folks to El Salvador. So I know there are these formal definitions of what a constitutional crisis is, but from where I sit in my schoolhouse rock knowledge of how our government is supposed to work, we are in one. We have a president of the United States who on a daily basis blows past the guardrails, pushes as far as he can get to test the system. And what has heartened me this week is hearing from Judge Boasberg and the judge who ruled yesterday in that beautiful 7-page opinion, where they are not just saying this isn't the right thing to do, they are pushing back just as aggressively from their respective federal benches, and I think we will be better for it.
Do you think, David, that I have been reading some Republican voices saying, specifically on the Abrego Garcia case, that this might be a bridge too far, that they feel that this simply jumping over due process completely. Do you think that there will be, from the right, some real critique that's meaningful?
It depends if you have the kind of job where you have to get elected to hold